Hello once again, my name is Stephen White, we're at Carlisle Library. This is a talk about the Reverend Sidney Swann. Before I go any further, I'd like to thank Carlisle Library for hosting these talks. I'd like to thank the director and producer, Tim Cottingham. Now, you park your car at the sands, you go down the steps into the underpass, and you'll see there a mural depicting scenes, odd moments in Carlisle's history. And there you see this one, done by Rosie Cunningham. In 1902, a Carlisle vicar cycled to London in 24 hours. So this is a story about this Cumbrian vicar, this Cumbrian clergyman. He was here for 21 years. Here we are, the Reverend Sidney Swann. When you see him, he brings to mind such words as committed churchman, athlete, record breaker, adventurer, inventor, aircraft pilot, bridge builder, fundraiser, practical carpenter. The list is endless. So I've called it Swann's Way. He was born in 1862 in Weymouth. His father had been in the Crimea War, a naval paymaster. Afterwards, he'd taken holy orders. Swann went to Marlborough, then Cambridge. He was there in 1883, and he immediately showed his potential as a sportsman. In 1883, 1884 and 1885, he rowed in the Cambridge team in the boat race against Oxford. And by this time, of course, this was a massive public event. Huge crowds flocked down to the Thames bank to see the two teams. Bets were put on. It was a carnival atmosphere. And here you can see Swann as a part of the Cambridge team. This is the Illustrated London News. Already he'd become a minor celebrity. Now, Swann really is his life story. It's a bit of a jigsaw, and we're missing some of the pieces. So we're going to jump about a little bit. In 1885, he became a deacon, a priest in 86. He became a curate in Plymouth. He married, went to the Isle of Man. That's where his first child was born, also called Sidney Swann. Also went to Cambridge, also rowed in the boat races, but he won better than his father, because in the 1912 Antwerp Olympics, he won a gold medal at rowing, and in 1920 won a silver medal. So going back to the father, as I say, we jump about a little bit, because from the Isle of Man, suddenly, in 1890, we find him in Japan as a missionary. I don't know what his motivation was, but this is an article in the newspaper in 1895. He'd already been there for 5 years, confirming his appointment as the honorary chaplain to the missions to seamen for British crews at Kobe in Japan. By this time, he'd taken up an interest in many things, and when in Japan, he competed in everything that could be started on land and sea. That's walking, jumping, running, rowing, hurling things, you name it, he did it, he excelled in it, and he usually won. Again, we've got a little bit of a jigsaw piece missing, but I'll just throw this in. Sometime round about now, he became the first man to cycle round Syria. Whether there's ever been a second man, I don't know, but Swann was the first man. In 1897, I don't know why again, he ends up here in Blackpool, a small country parish about 4 miles north of Carlisle. He's got no relatives or particular association with the county that I know of, but here we find him in this small rural parish. He'd been cycling for many years, and he determined to see how far north he could cycle in 24 hours. So one morning, he set off from Blackford at 10 o'clock. He cycled through the morning, through the afternoon. He cycled all through the night. And at 10 o'clock the following morning, he found himself in Inverness, a truly phenomenal feat. And again, he was before the public. But, they were interested in these cycling vicars. From Blackford, he moved to St. Aidan's in Carlisle. He was there in 1901. St. Aidan's was a new church. Carlisle was expanding, the population growing. New church accommodation was needed. And this is the church just after it was built. And Swann was its first vicar. And when the church opened, it was already groaning under a heavy debt. As we can see here, Swann immediately set about fundraising. When he came in 1900, there was a £4,000 debt on the church. That's equivalent probably to something like £160,000, £170,000. 4 years later, it was reported that the debt was now only £780, and he got the Bishop of Barrow to promise 250 if the remaining 530 could be raised before the end of the year. And before he left in 1905, that money had been raised. So this is the vicarage for St Aidan's. It's on Portland Square. It's that central building. In the summer of 1902, every morning he would draw the curtains of his study, stare out and look at the tall industrial chimneys on the Carlisle landscape. What he was looking for, he was looking to see which way the smoke was blowing. He was looking for a northerly wind. He'd now determined to see how far south he could cycle in a day. He'd seen how far north he could go. Now he determined to see how far south he could go. What he was waiting for was, of course, a northerly wind, because, as he said himself, there was no point in trying to cycle against a dead noser. This particular morning, he threw back the curtains, and it was a northerly wind, but it was squally and showery, so he didn't set off at first. He waited until 4 minutes past 2, when he said, despite the rain, he had that wind, and he set off on his epic journey. And I'm just going to give you one or two snatches from that epic journey. He wrote up a very colourful article in the newspaper, and it's well worth a read. And at the end of this talk, I've got the library's email address. Pop us an email and we'll send you a word copy of his article. And I promise it'll give you 10 minutes of smiles. He was an experienced cyclist. He knew the importance of travelling light. So he said, I borrowed my wife's little watch instead of my turnip, had the lining taken out of all my clothes, bought specially light stockings and shoes, stripped off the mudguards and all extras, and refused change in copper. You know, you're smiling already. And this is the machine he cycled upon, the very latest design. It's a Dursley Peterson. As you can see, it's quite sleek looking. You can still buy these machines today, actually. It was made of different triangles to give it added strength. Total weight, £25. An average Tour de France machine is about £15. Swann himself was 14 stone. But the interesting and marvellous thing is it was a single machine, single-geared machine. There were no derailleur gears. He just had that single gear to cycle upon. In his own words, it rained most of the way to Penrith, but I'll at least run that far for exercise. I can come back again if the things aren't too favourable. For in truth, the roads were a sea of mud. I let her drive down the hills while a fan of mud spray opened over me and painted me from head to foot, mouth, ears and eyes, till I learnt the trick of holding my head over to one side, shutting one eye and dodging the fountain to some extent. Well, just imagine it. I'm a bit of a cyclist myself, so I know that you often get shouted at on bikes. And here Swann says he's going over Shap and a boy informed him that the bike was all big for him. He comes into Lancaster and has a puncture. He doesn't have any support team, of course. He has to help himself. To complete my discomfiture, my wheel punctured and I was reduced to repeated pumpings to enable me to crawl the 7 miles into Lancaster, slipped quickly through the crowd of volunteers gathering for a parade and found a repair shop. Workman out, doubtless a volunteer, so borrowed the shop from his wife and set to myself. He repaired the puncture himself, but this set him back 10 minutes. Off he sped again into the night. So he bumped into Warrington in the dark at 11:30. One has heard of the famous smells of Cologne, but no place in England that I have ever experienced could hold a candle in such matters to Warrington. It was just 3 miles of insults, and on he goes. He gets lost. He has to climb up a signpost with his bike torch to see where he's going. The dawn's breaking, and he decides no longer does he need the lamp. Leave it at Tinsor Post Office and he'll write for it the next week. He's into Lichfield at 4:30, and there he buys a pint of milk from an old man who's cooking his breakfast at 4:30 in the morning. Odd, he wonders why. Ran into Coventry, 91 miles from London at 7:25, full 40 minutes behind time. Oh, how sore one is. It's a pain to hold the vibrating handlebars. Try it which way you will. Backhanded, straight-handed, fingertips or palms. It is utter distress to sit on the saddle. So far he's been cycling all day and all night. At Toaster, reached at 10, we get our second breakfast, and now he's 45 minutes behind time. He starts off again. Wild charge across the road by a collie, a grab at the brake, smash, bruised and cut knee, badly shaken body, smarting hands and feet. I told the owner what I thought of his dog. At Barnet by 1 o'clock, this is 23 hours into his cycle. It is now becoming increasingly difficult to imagine one is still fresh. Indeed, it was obvious one was dead tired. And exactly 24 hours afterwards, he cycles into London, just missing an express to Carlisle. This was a very famous cycle ride and once more put his name before the public. So much so that the makers of the bike, Dursley Peterson, used Swann in their advertising. And here you can see him upon the bike. And he says, I've been cycling for 25 years. I've never had a machine to equal it. Fantastic. Back to parochial and parish matters. And here I really should say a word for his wife. She very much remains in the shadows, in the background, behind the curtain. But of course, she brought up the family, Josephine, and she really, I'd imagine he was often away, held the parish together. So 3 cheers to her. When Swann came to St. Aidan's, there was, to his dismay, no bell tower. On the left there, you can see the bell tower above the marketplace. And Mr. Banks of Highmoor Hall, Wigton, had offered a bell to the city council to put in the bell tower, but they'd refused. Swann persuaded Banks to give him this bell. He brought the bell on a horse and cart down to St. Aidan's. He put this iron girder in the back of the church and hung the bell from it. He did this, it would seem, without getting a faculty from the diocese, without consulting anybody, just on his own initiative, doing it pretty much Swann's way. And if you go around the back of the church today, you'll see this odd contraption hanging at the back of the church. Swann, again in Carlisle, the paper reported, whilst living in Carlisle, Mr. Swann, at his own expense, bought property in Castle Street, pulled it down, set it back, and rebuilt it in a manner which opened out the view of the east window of the cathedral on the main street of the city. And this is what I think he did. Castle Street, Specsavers. At the top of Specsavers, you'll see the date 03, telling us that that part of the building was built in 03. You can see the original line of the street would have continued across above Freetime, blocking out the view of the east window. What I believe Swann did was to set back the street at that angle, which you can quite clearly see, allowing it to be appreciated from the Green Market. In fact, he wanted the cathedral to demolish the Porter's Lodge, but they wouldn't have that. 1905, Swann decided to move on. He never put round his roots really in any particular place. He was constantly moving. He preached his last sermon, and again, this must be perhaps unique, or made me smile, certainly. On the 2nd of July, this is what he said. He thanked the congregation for their attendance at the church. They attended Sunday after Sunday, and he'd been very much surprised. He often wondered why they came. As a clergyman, never said that to the congregation. I don't know. His next port of call was Crosby Ravensworth in Westmoreland, a mountain parish, and there immediately he set about on his adventures. He was in the paper and the press again as the vicar who canoed down the River Eden from Crosby Ravensworth to the Solway, in a homemade boat, of course, sat on a petrol can. One of his neighbours put this little note on his front door. It's a joke. Sidney Swann and Co., the vicarage, Crosby Ravensworth, by appointment of the High Sheriff of Westmoreland. Roads plans, lakes made, rafts constructed, blah, blah, blah. Horses frightened, heads sat on at reasonable rates, sermons plain, coloured or venomous, churches filled or emptied, souls cured, parishioners reformed, bishops taken in hand. And I think this sums them up quite nicely. I think he was a dominant personality, very confident. It was also the milieu was really the squirearchy at the time, and he became friends at Crackenthorpe Hall. It was still a very regulated society. One day he was there at Crackenthorpe Hall speaking to Lady Velda Machel, and she said they just received the estimate from a local builder for throwing a footbridge over the River Eden near their house. The price of the bridge was £350. Did that seem a lot, Mr. Swann? Mr. Swann said yes, and he immediately suggested that he could do the job for half the price. And here is the bridge he built on the left-hand side. Amazing. It stood there until 1968, when it was washed away in the heavy floods. Floods which also took down the bridges at Appleby and Langwathby. And Peter Conlon took this photograph on the right-hand side in 1982, showing one of the concrete boats that he constructed and built, holding the bridge up. He was certainly a very practical man. Now we come across another character, Samuel Franklin Cody. You might have heard of him. He made the first aircraft flight with a British plane in this country. He was American, wasn't called Cody at all. His early history is lost. It was mainly his own legend. He came to Europe making with Wild West shows, and he came to Carlisle with his Klondike Nugget show, which appeared at Her Majesty's Theatre. Real cowboys, splendid broncos, splendid scenery. And somehow or other, he became friendly with Swann. They seemed two very different characters. Cody, by this time, had left his wife and was living with another woman. The children he claimed were his common-law wife's. But he did share a common ground with Swann. They were both adventurers. We don't know how they met. Perhaps it was at the Klondike Nugget show. More likely, as a part of his Wild West shows, Cody would challenge local cycle champions to races between himself on a horse and the local champion on a bike. That sounds very much up Swann's alley. We do know that sometime in the 1900s, Swann apparently persuaded Cody to come to Carlisle, to come to Houghton House and demonstrate his man-lifting kites. And here you can see what Cody manufactured and made and actually sold to the army. These kites that took him and his sons thousands of feet up into the air. Swann recalls actually that a gust of wind snapped and took one of the guide ropes away, and he ran after it across the field, just missed catching hold of it, and he conjectured afterwards probably it was a good job, because heaven knows where he would have been swept away to. So he was interested in Cody, he was interested in flight. So in 1909, October, he attended an aviation meeting in Blackpool. This is the first time he'd ever seen an aeroplane. He was very much taken with it. Perhaps he was more taken by the challenge for the first British circular trip, man-made aircraft trip of 1 mile. £1,000 was being offered for the first flight, this first circular flight. Swann went home to Crosby Ravensworth and immediately set about building an aircraft. And after only 29 days of first seeing this aircraft at Blackpool, he'd actually designed and built his own machine. It's incredible. His son later recalled that it was very much made up from day to day. One moment the tail would be at the front, the next day it would be at the back. The engine would be there, then there. Well, this is the machine as it eventually appeared at Aintree. By this time the prize had already been claimed, but there was a new prize. The jam magnate Hartley had offered a prize for the first flight between Manchester and Liverpool. Swann was up for capturing it. He arrived at Aintree, and there a fellow contestant was his old friend Cody. Cody offered him every assistance. They put their planes together. He advised him, lent him tools, gave him directions. And there you are. There is the Reverend Swann at the wheel of this contraption, this flying cathedral. He made several attempts to get into the air, but never did. There were accidents, tippings over, redesigns. It didn't work. He went back to Crosby Ravensworth and started a complete new design. When he built the new aircraft, he searched about for a flat field. Crosby Ravensworth, a mountainous parish, and it was difficult to find a flat field. Anyway, the day came, it was all or nothing. Chocks away, and he set off. Peter Conlon, in his excellent book on early flying in Dumfriesshire and the Lake Counties, said it couldn't really be described as a man-powered flight. It was more really a controlled leap of about 30 feet before he crashed down on a flock of sheep, killing one of them. Swann was disgusted. He'd had enough of it, and he went back to what he knew, which was rowing. In September 1911, he set a record for rowing the English Channel in 3 hours and 55 minutes, which is surprising enough. But the really interesting thing is he beat the previous best time by 3 hours and 20 minutes. He rowed across the Channel in his river skiff. He said it was like riding an unbroken colt for 3 hours. He was almost swamped by boats once or twice because, of course, it was an incredibly busy channel. From Crosby Ravensworth, he moves to Levens. Once again, he makes a big impact there. He's only there for 2 or 3 years. He made the acquaintance again of the Squire Archie, the lord of the manor. It actually was a lady of the manor, Lady Theodosia Baggett. Her husband, Jocelyn, had died in 1913. She will reappear later. Swann was very active in the parish. Here you can see what he says he did. He made a lich gate, put in new roof timbers, moved the organ down the chancel, built an organ chamber, made choir stalls, lowered the pulpit, got leech to decorate the chancel, set the pews at a comfortable angle, put cushions in the seats, planted flowering shrubs in the churchyard, and generally so transformed the church that one may hardly have known it. Plus, there was no churchyard or burial ground when Swann arrived. He persuaded local farmers, probably just told them, to lay out the churchyard with soil and plant it with grass. But the difficulty was to get the first burial. So he bribed somebody with a sovereign to get a corpse. And once there was a gravestone there, soon others came along, for it was no longer thought to be lonely. He also, and you can see this today, built this bell shelter. He said, I got 3 Milnthorpe steel bells, which were only used as flowering pots, for their tone was so evil. These I hung in a Japanese shed in the churchyard, and I'd struck it with a wooden mallet that greatly improved their tone. It probably rings a bell if you remember he was interested in bells in St. Aidan's, bells in Levens, and we'll come back to bells again. He left Levens and moved out of the county to Holbrook in Derbyshire. First World War had started, and we already find him in the papers. Vicar's Practical Patriotism. The Reverend Sidney Swann, Vicar of Holbrook, Derbyshire, is about to pay another flying visit to the war zone. He has recently helped to establish a movable hospital. And here we come back to Lady Baggett. Lady Baggett had experience of establishing war hospitals. She'd established war hospitals during the Boer War and later in the Serbian War in 1913. At the outbreak of the war in 1914, she established a hospital of friendship in Belgium, and Swann became a driver of the ambulance, taking month in, month out with somebody from Carlisle. There's another side to Swann. He wasn't the perfect character by any means, and somehow this particular incident feels a little sour. In 1917, the papers report that Swann had been arrested and charged, was appearing before the Matlock petty sessions. The background to the story is that at the very last moment he was asked to stand in for a speaker who was taken ill at a national service meeting. He felt it was his duty to go. He'd been ploughing all day. He went and gave the speech. They suggested he stay overnight, but no, he had to get back to his ploughing. He was ploughing again at 6 a.m. So he got on his motorbike and cycled home. He had an unobscured light. If you remember, this was the time of the Gotha bombers and the Zeppelins blackouts. He was stopped by a policeman saying, "You've got an unobscured light." Swann's reply was that he was 300 miles away from the German trenches. The chairman of the bench told him that wasn't relevant and be quiet. Then Swann turned on the young policeman, the young constable, and shouted at him that you should be in the trenches instead of stopping me. Chairman again said that was irrelevant, to which Swann replied it was very relevant as he was an Englishman. He was fined 7 shillings. Swann said he wouldn't pay. and walked out. He said he preferred to go to prison, so I don't believe he went to prison or paid the 7 shillings. He was a very forceful character, at times edging into being distasteful. I don't know what you make of this. In 1916, he records in his diary that when returning from France wearing a captain's uniform, as he was entitled to do as a serving member of the clergy, he was stopped from boarding a train by a policeman who asked for his papers. Swann simply knocked him to the ground and, sprinting, caught the train as it pulled out. Back to his sporting endeavours, and this really makes me scratch my head and think, is this believable? At the time of this particular sporting endeavour, he is 55. And this was the challenge he undertook. It was to paddle half a mile, walk half a mile, cycle half a mile, swim half a mile, row half a mile, and run half a mile. That's 6 half miles. And all these were accomplished in less than half an hour, in 29 minutes. Is that possible? He appears in the paper again. In 1918, his wife dies, Josephine, and we find that in 1920, he marries Lady Baggett. He then moves back to Cumberland, returns to Moorland Parish, and in his own words, he had an invigorating effect on the parish. The previous incumbent had been there for 50 years and things were rather sleepy. He certainly woke them up with a bang. The congregation increased. As an example, the vicarage on a hilltop, he built a water wheel which pumped fresh water uphill from the Pow Donnet spring to the vicarage. Before this, the vicarage had relied on rainwater from the gutters as there was no well. He next made a contrivance with hammers and wires which allowed one man at ground level to strike the 3 bells in the high tower, so avoiding climbing the great ladders. He was also the leading spirit in creating the War Memorial. Very active indeed. Just going back to Lady Baggett. Lady Baggett was never known as Mrs. Swann. She was always Theodosia Baggett. And perhaps was a little bit eccentric herself. This is quite a nice story told about her, that when she first received Holy Communion from her husband, she drained the wine to the dregs, I'm not sure you're supposed to know that, and said, "Perfectly delicious," before handing it back. Indeed. When he was Vicar of Moorland, again he was involved in an incident that I don't think shows him in the best of lights. It shows that he wasn't sympathetic to the working man. In 1919, there was a national railway strike. There was a proposed reduction in the railmen's wages, and of course the men struck against this. Swann acted as a blackleg, working in the Carlisle sheds, the sheds of the London and North Western Railway, cleaning the engines. This caused tremendous resentment amongst the railwaymen, and one day he was spotted walking down Botchergate. He was mobbed, mainly by women, but then by men. We don't know how it would have turned out, probably nastily, but luckily a policeman came upon the scene, and drawing his truncheon, he kept the crowd back, while Swann, unperturbed, jumped on a passing tram. The railwayman wrote to the bishop saying that Swann, if this was one of the Church of England priests, he would turn him against the church, and this was disgraceful behaviour on the part of a clergyman. Swann wrote back to the local branch of the NUR, explaining his actions and saying that any money he received for his work he would gladly pass on to them. They wrote back saying they would never take his blood money. Swann's last act was Vicar of Linfield in the Diocese of Chichester from 1929 to 1937. Later in life he turned a bit strange and erratic, and John Julius Norwich in his book Christmas Crackers writes about a letter he received from a parishioner saying that in the latter years, when Swann had been relieved of his job and the incumbency had turned over to the Reverend Fear, Swann stayed in the village and became a very menacing and intimidating figure. Somebody who actually at one moment had threatened to attack his wife with a kitchen knife. The letter went on to say that he was taken away in a straitjacket. But let's not remember him in these dark moments. He died in 1942 with the result of a fall off his bicycle. The obituary in the Times the following day called him a versatile sportsman, but I remember him in his own words, a sky pilot aiming for the heavens. So thank you for listening, and if you'd like to get hold of a copy of the Reverend Swann's record of his famous cycle ride to London in 24 hours, give us an email, carlisle.library@cumbrian.gov.uk. Thank you. My name's Stephen White and I used to work at Cumbrian Libraries, and this is one of a series of talks on local history subject. It's just my take on the talks that you'll be able to find on Facebook and YouTube. Some might be right, some might be wrong. If you've got any comments, get in contact. Got any suggestions? I'd love to hear from you.